So how do you understand difficult people? Find out on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Today we're going to be talking about how to understand difficult people, because an inevitable part of life is dealing with difficult people. And an effective way of knowing how to deal with difficult people is understanding difficult people, because the sad reality is you can't avoid everyone that you deem to be difficult. So, Liz, before we get into this, why would you say it is important to understand difficult people? Like, if somebody is difficult and we can just minimize our contact with them, isn't that the better thing to do? Or is there a reason that we should understand them and try to respond?
Well, in some contexts, you might not be able to completely avoid them. Like if the difficult person you're concerned about is your boss, then you have to find a way to be able to effectively work with them. So there are important reasons to try to understand a difficult person and see if there are ways that you can get along with them and communicate more effectively with them.
Well, that's a really important point. Another thing just that came to my mind was difficulty isn't necessarily bad. Exercise is healthy and it is difficult. And so in a lot of ways, developing these sorts of skills can really help you grow and help you better relate to people, and can help you cultivate better relationships and help you in a variety of ways that can benefit your mental health.
Yeah, and if you think of someone who works a customer service role, they're going to come in contact with a whole variety of people as well. So when you're exposed to a lot of people, you're going to end up having a difficult customer at some point. And learning how to manage that person effectively can make you better at your job and give you more career opportunity in the long run.
Okay, so getting right into it, and I think we should probably let our listeners know that we plan to do at least a couple podcasts on difficult people, because it's just such a common issue. But getting right into it, so how do we understand difficult people?
So there are different kinds of difficult people, but if you notice that you're just having an emotional response and you're finding it difficult to work with this person in whatever context, whether it's a family member or someone you're seeing at work or a friend, trying to understand their point of view, putting yourself into their shoes and trying to really immerse yourself in how they're viewing the situation, it can help you develop a more effective way of communicating with them and resolving whatever the issue is.
Well, that seems to be a bit of a balancing act, though, because I may not always be able to recognize how someone is thinking or feeling in a situation. Like, just to give you an example, like, I can relate in some sense to a younger person because I too was a younger person, and I can think of how I felt and the challenges I was having at the time. But younger people, or people of, like, let's say Generation Z or iGen, they are being brought up in a bit of a different context. So how do we know when we're actually relating to them, or when we are just making assumptions and kind of projecting our own assumptions and experiences on somebody else?
That's a great point. So if we're thinking of something like the younger generation and trying to understand them, I think it's important to keep in mind cultural differences. Like, an age group that's grown up on social media where, their disputes are very often public to their friend group. That is a very different context for them than, our generation who grew up in a more private social thing where we were communicating by MSN or something like that, where those interactions were generally more isolated. And then you have, the older generation who didn't even have computers when they were growing up. So there's this very big cultural shift that's happened there that, just trying to understand, well, how would I have felt if I was dealing with these issues? Trying to put yourself in that point of view, get a sense of it, trying to actually understand how the person is feeling. And if you can't imagine it on your own, then asking them some questions to try to get an understanding of what's going on, what are their concerns, what's causing them to be upset, and trying to get a deeper understanding of what's going on.
Or beyond the emotional, a difficult person might just take a different approach. And so trying to understand the different approach they're taking, like anybody who has been has done any sort of group assignment in school will know that different people approach things differently, and usually there's some dominant personalities that ultimately end up driving the approach and how things are done, but that's not always successful. So being open-minded and willing to consider other points of view can be a really important part of it, because if you're just going to say, well, I don't, this person has a different approach, but it's wrong and I'm right, then, that attitude is not going to help you understand this person or relate to them or do you really any good.
Yeah, and I do think trying to understand the difference in perspective can help you also sort out, is this a difficult person, or is it that we just have a different perspective on things? Especially, with a newly married couple, they might realize we have two different ways of doing the dishes. That doesn't mean that one way is better than the other. It can just mean that it's different.
Well, and also an important part of this can be focused on a goal. Knowing the goal of why you're trying to understand, focus on the goal. If you're not going to have conflicts about how to do the dishes, as long as you focus on the goal of the dishes getting done. So are there any other sorts of questions or ways we can know that we're on the right track in terms of trying to understand someone who we feel is being difficult?
I think some of the key questions are trying to understand the other person's values. Are they feeling threatened, or like their sense of identity is being challenged? Because those things can be very big triggers that can cause someone to become more difficult if they feel a sense of threat towards those things.
Well, another thing is you can always talk to the person. You can always ask. You have to be a little careful about how you do this, and depending on what the issue is. But if they're taking a different approach to something, as long as you approach them with an attitude of, well, I'm just wanting to hear you out, I'm willing to learn, that can actually be a really good way. I don't obviously mention to them, well, you feel threatened by me or etc. But oftentimes talking to a person and asking questions and listening can really convey a lot.
Yeah, and it can take time to figure that out. You might even have to reflect on a conversation after it happens, because if someone is difficult to talk to, your emotional reaction might get in the way of actually being able to understand the person.
And again, we're always going to focus it on have a goal and maintain your goal. So make sure your goal is to understand the person, Because if you're like in a work sort of situation, if you're dealing with a difficult person and you just don't want to take the approach they're taking, you need to be self-aware that maybe you're the inflexible one, maybe you're the one being difficult. And so if your goal is to truly understand somebody and work to sort out differences, then you're much more likely to actually be able to do that. Whereas if you just focus on, well, I want to do things this way, or I want to be right, or I want to be vindicated, then that attitude is really not going to, that attitude is not going to get you anywhere. And different people have different tolerances for difficult situations and difficult people and stress, so all of that is important to consider as well. So Liz, is there any other tips that you would offer our listeners, or any other input you may have?
What I would say is you can put in the comments what kind of difficult people you find the most challenging, and then we'll make sure to do a follow-up podcast on that in the future.
All right, well, that's all we have time for today, but if you like our content, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that small steps can lead to big changes. We'll see you next time.